All right, sports fans, how's everybody out there doing? William Martin coming at you one more time here on YouTube with another edition of the 300 Pounds of Sports Knowledge Podcast. The class of 2023 for the Pro Football Hall of Fame was announced last night, and it's a stellar group of nine guys. Darrell Revis, Demarcus Ware, Joe Thomas, Joe Klecko, Don Coryell, Ken Riley, Rondé Barber, Zach Thomas, and Chuck Howley are all headed to Canton. It's been a long time coming for Don Coryell. And if anybody has listened to my podcast last couple of years over the subject of the NFL Hall, or pardon me, the Pro Football Hall of Fame, Don Coryell is a name that I have consistently talked about as far as him not getting into Canton. And I think the younger generation doesn't understand Mr. Coryell's impact on the game. You think back to Air Coryell, which, really first came into vogue with the St. Louis Cardinals. But when you think about its heyday, obviously it was with the San Diego Chargers, but it really started before that when Don Coryell was at San Diego State. And to give you an idea as far as his offense, a lot of the teams nowadays are using it. I mean, Dick Vermeil, who got into the Pro Football Hall of Fame last year and was a student of Don Coryell, he went to bat and said, listen, we used Don Coryell's Air Coryell offense in 1999 when we won the championship with the St. Louis Rams. It's just one of those where he was an innovator for the modern passing game. He knew matchups. He knew about having the passing tight end, having the backs come out of the field, like a lot of motion. It was just so much that Don Coryell was a part of. And now he gets his spot. And this is after, the likes of Joe Gibbs and John Madden. They went to bat for him because Joe Gibbs was an assistant under Coryell in San Diego with the Chargers. And then John Madden was with him at San Diego State. So they understand the importance of what he brought to the table. Big Bad Joe Klecko from the New York Sack Exchange. And I say Big Bad Joe Klecko because, it's one of those where if you go back and you remember Smokey and the Bandit Part 2 when he had that brief part in there, and of course the Snowman called him Big Bulldog Joe Klecko, but nonetheless, you think about that Sack Exchange pass rush that the New York Jets had in the late 70s, early 80s with Joe Klecko, Mark Gastineau, Marty Lyons, and Abdul Salam. They were relentless and they did not make life easy for opposing quarterbacks. And these are the days, of course, when the Jets still played at Shea Stadium. But nonetheless, Joe Klecko was a ferocious pass rusher. Now he's going to get his opportunity in Canton. Ken Riley, and this is another man that I've talked about. He's been overlooked for too long as well. His 65 career interceptions during his 15-year career are still tied for the fifth most all time with Charles Woodson, who is in the Hall of Fame. I said it, before. There's no way that you can have a man who has the stats that Ken Riley has and not have him in the Hall of Fame. It was a travesty. He finally gets in. Now, some guys who were on the ballot for the first time and they got in right away, and it was going to be very hard to deny either one of them. And that's Darrell Revis and Joe Thomas. And you think about what Darrell Revis meant to the cornerback position, a first round pick of the New York Jets. And it's very interesting because they got him out of Pitt and they got him just before the Steelers picked. And the Steelers were set to take Darrell Revis. They knew all about him. Obviously playing at Pitt, Pitt basically has the same facilities as the Steelers. And they knew more about him than any other team, and the Jets just happened to jump up and take him. But you think about the whole Revis Island thing for the Jets, and I mean, he had the ability to stick like glue to a who's who of wide receivers in their prime. You think about the likes of Calvin Johnson, one name that comes to mind, Randy Moss, and so many others. Revis was step for step with them, and this is in an era where, of course, the rules did not favor the defensive backs, and Revis might not have the interceptions because he wasn't thrown to a lot, but nonetheless, he knew how to shut down one part of the field, and he gets his opportunity in Canton, which is well deserved. Joe Thomas, arguably the best left tackle of his era. He's probably not talked about as much due to the fact that number one, he's an offensive lineman. Secondly, he played on some very bad Cleveland Browns teams, but it's still good that the committee recognized what he meant to the game of football. Zach Thomas, and you think about all of those great years that Zach Thomas had with the Miami Dolphins, and of course, he joins his tag team partner defensively in Jason Taylor in Canton now. But for a guy like Zach Thomas, this guy was a tackling machine. Came out of Texas Tech undersized, but credit to Jimmy Johnson because Jimmy Johnson saw something in him. And Zach Thomas was a playmaker from the word go with the Dolphins. He quickly became a leader on that defensive side of the ball, and he was an anchor. And you just think about what Zach Thomas meant for so many years to the Miami Dolphins. Very smart football player, very good range, and he played with a lot of determination. And now he gets his rightful spot in the Pro Football Hall of Fame. Rondé Barber, the outstanding cornerback for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. He's in that rare air with the 20 sack, 20 interception club, and he actually finished his career with 47 interceptions and 28 career sacks. And the list of great defensive players from that era for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers in Canton continues to grow. Warren Sapp is there, John Lynch is there, Derek Brooks is there, and now you got Rondé Barber. And you think about the Bucks of that era, one of the best defenses of all time. And now their players are getting their just due in the Pro Football Hall of Fame. DeMarcus Ware, his 138 and a half sacks really don't do justice as far as how relentless that he was as a pass rusher. DeMarcus Ware was a player that needed to be accounted for at all times, and not just accounted for consistently receiving a double team, but he just knew leverage. He was a big guy height wise. He was very chiseled. And this guy just knew and understood leverage very fast off of that edge, very fast for most offensive tackles. And it was one of those where he consistently had to be double teamed. And even a double team wasn't enough because he still knew how to get to the quarterback and wreak havoc. Another former Dallas Cowboy in Chuck Howley, and when you think about Chuck Howley, his name is always going to be, in a very distinct spot in NFL history. One of the few defensive players to be the MVP of the Super Bowl. He was the MVP of Super Bowl five, but he is the only player to be the MVP of the game on a losing team. And, Chuck Howley, you think about um, Tom Landry's defense for so many years with the Dallas Cowboys and players from that era, such as Bob Lilly, are in the Hall of Fame. But now Chuck Howley joined so many great Cowboys from that era in Canton. Now, those are the guys who got in, and there's going to be some guys that I'm going to talk about that I've talked about in the past who haven't gotten in, and I'm going to add a little bit to that list. Number one, Devin Hester, and you think about what Devin Hester meant to, the Chicago Bears and meant to the NFL when he played. I mean, this was the biggest game changer from the kickoff punt return positions because the thing is teams would make the mistake as far as kicking to Devin Hester. And it was one of those where he didn't need that much of an opening. And if anybody remembers when Devin Hester played, it was one of those where he made the punt return and the kick return exciting because it wasn't even like he had to break tackles. He just had flat out speed, maybe make one, possibly two moves, but he was off to the races. And this guy was a game changer. More kick returns and more punt returns than anybody in NFL history. And I think it's a travesty that he is still not in the Hall of Fame. L.C. Greenwood, the defensive end from the Pittsburgh Steelers, and he played 13 years with the Steelers. And of course, he was a part of that steel curtain. And I think what hurts LC's case is the fact that, so many players that he played with for the Steelers are already in Hall of Fame defensively. Joe Green, Jack Ham, Jack Lambert, and Mel Blount. But make no mistake about it, LC Greenwood was one of the better defensive ends in the National Football League in the 1970s. Andre Johnson, he had all of those stellar years at wide receiver for the Houston Texans. And I think what hurts Andre Johnson is the fact that there's a little bit of a logjam at the wide receiver position. And sometimes what we've seen over the years is where there's a logjam at one particular position, the committee, they're not going to like just let several guys through, even though, what, if it's all about being the best of the best, you know what? You got to put guys in, and Andre Johnson definitely makes a legit case to be in the Hall of Fame. Joe Jacoby, and you think about the Hogs and what they meant to all of those great Washington championship teams of the 1980s and early 1990s. Russ Grimm is already in, but the bottom line is Washington does not win without the Hogs. Because if you think about it, Joe Gibbs won three Super Bowls with three different starting quarterbacks and three different starting running backs. The one constant for those championship teams for Washington was their offensive line. Torrey Holt at wide receiver, I think I'm going to put him in the same slot that Andre Johnson is as far as the logjam at the wide receiver position. But you think about that greatest show on turf, Kurt Warner, Marshall Faulk, Isaac Bruce, they're all in. It's time for Torrey Holt to join them in Canton as well. And of course, the guy who blocked for them up front, Orlando Pace. Dave Brown has 62 career interceptions. And just like I've talked about Ken Riley for years, Dave Brown is another guy that, you cannot overlook his stats. And speaking of cornerbacks, Everson Walls, 57 career interceptions, a part of some good Dallas Cowboys teams in the early 80s, won a Super Bowl with the New York Giants in 1990, has 57 career interceptions himself, and led the NFL in interceptions on three separate occasions. Everson Walls is long overdue to be in Canton. And then, I talked about the logjam at wide receiver. There's also a logjam in regards to the pass rushers because you got some guys that have been overlooked. And I'm talking about Leslie O'Neal, Jared Allen, Jim Marshall. Jim Marshall, for me, I don't think gets enough credit. It's been like it's hindered him, unfortunately, that he played with Alan Page and Carl Eller, who are both in the Hall of Fame. But you look at Jim Marshall, he put up some tremendous years as far as being a pass rusher from the defensive end position, and more importantly, his longevity. He had the longest consecutive games played streak in the NFL for many years until it was broken by Jeff Fiegels, a punter. And that's no slight to Jeff Fiegels, but playing punter and being a defensive end in the NFL, especially in the era that Jim Marshall played in, you know what? That is definitely something that you got to tip your hat to. Coy Bacon is another older player that doesn't get the recognition he deserves as far as rushing the passer. And some guys from the 80s and 90s, the likes of Clyde Simmons, played for so many good teams with the Philadelphia Eagles, with the likes of Reggie White. Simeon Rice, and I think he gets in eventually because this is another player on that Tampa Bay Bucks defense. And Simeon Rice was a guy, long, lengthy, but he knew how to get to the passer. Greg Townsend, I mean, if anybody remembers the LA Raiders of the 1980s, and you think about their rugged image on the defensive side of the ball, you had Howie Long, you had Lyle Alzado, you had Rod Martin, but you also had Greg Townsend. And the thing is, Greg Townsend was a man. That's basically the best way that you could sum up the way that he played defensive end. Pat Swilling for so many years on those great New Orleans Saints defenses. And you think about the Dome Patrol, Ricky Jackson is in, Sam Mills is in, Pat Swilling definitely has to get in. Al Bubba Baker. You think about Al Baker's first year in the NFL. He set the unofficial record for sacks. Of course, sacks weren't an official stat at the time, but he had 23 sacks in his first year in the NFL, finished with more than 130. And I think it's a scenario where Al Bubba Baker definitely deserves some love for the Pro Football Hall of Fame. Willie Anderson, so many good years playing offensive tackle for the Cincinnati Bengals. Vince Wilfork being an anchor for so many years for the New England Patriots. Eventually, he needs to get some love. Reggie Wayne, I think, is going to be in that same slot with the likes of Torrey Holt. Steve Smith Sr. is another guy who definitely deserves to be in there. But they're all going to be, put to clump together, if you will, with Andre Johnson. And I don't see a scenario where the committee is going to be pushing through multiple wide receivers at the same time. It's just like the pass rushers. Patrick Willis was one of the best middle linebackers of his era. Of course, his career was cut short due to injury, but I don't think that that is something that should be held against him. And then, you're talking about the pass rushers, Robert Mathis as well. He put up some great numbers throughout his career for the Indianapolis Colts. But again, it's just so many guys at his position. I don't see the committee taking all of them at once. We saw Don Coryell get in this year. Two head coaches that I've gone to bat for before, and I'm going to continue to go to bat for. And I'm saying that like I have a vote in this, but anybody who's listening understands where I come from, and that's Dan Reeves and Marty Schottenheimer. I think Marty Schottenheimer's playoff record has been held against him. But you think about it, he took Kansas City to the playoffs, got them to the AFC Championship game. He got the Cleveland Browns to the AFC Championship game twice. He also got the San Diego Chargers to the playoffs as well. And the thing is with Marty Schottenheimer, every team that he coached, they got better based on from when he got there as opposed to when it was time for him to leave. He was definitely a difference maker. And then also Dan Reeves. And Dan Reeves, like Marty Schottenheimer, top 10 for wins all time by head coaches in NFL history. Dan Reeves got three different teams to the playoffs, and Dan Reeves also got two different teams to the Super Bowl in the Atlanta Falcons and the Denver Broncos. For me, you know what? You can't use the term that, Dan Reeves shouldn't be in because he never won a Super Bowl. Well, I got a news flash for you. Okay, Dan Reeves was 0-4 in the Super Bowl, yes. But so were Bud Grant and Marv Levy, and both of them are in Canton. And Dan Reeves is definitely deserving of a spot. And I don't think that he has gotten the credit over the years that he deserves, just like Don Coryell, who finally got into the Pro Football Hall of Fame this year. Now, some key names to keep an eye on who are going to be first time eligible players and personnel for the Pro Football Hall of Fame next year: Julius Peppers, Antonio Gates, Eric Berry, and Haloti Nada are just some of the names. And for J. Pep, you think about his 159 career sacks, and you think about him. This guy was the second overall pick, first overall pick by the Carolina Panthers the year he came out of college. You think about what he meant for that organization, what he did at the pass rush, at the defensive end position, and his ability just as a freak athlete. That was just what Julius Peppers brought to the table, and it's going to be hard pressed to deny him. Antonio Gates could possibly get in, but we've seen in the past where tight ends don't necessarily get in on the first ballot. I mean, I thought for sure Shannon Sharp would have been a first ballot Hall of Famer, but he wasn't. It's going to be interesting to see what happens with Antonio Gates. Haloti Nada, I think, eventually gets in. I don't think he gets in the first time around, but you think about those great Ravens defenses of his era. Of course, Ray Lewis is in, Ed Reed is in, Terrell Suggs. When he becomes eligible, he will definitely make a very compelling case to get in as well. And I think at some point, Haloti Nada will get in. So as far as who I think gets in next year, I think the only guarantee, in my opinion, is Julius Peppers. Everybody else besides that, it's going to be a toss up. It's going to be very interesting to see. But I think what we've seen recently, more and more in recent years, is the fact that the veteran committee is pushing players that have been overlooked into the Hall of Fame and letting them get their just due. So it's going to be interesting. It's going to be interesting to see what veteran players, guys who have been out of football for probably 20, 30, or 40 years, that get the just due that they deserve. But nonetheless, everybody in this 2023 class for Canton is well deserved. Congratulations to them and their families, and they're going to have an opportunity to share that experience this summer. But if you're the New York Jets and you're fans of the New York Jets, you got to be happy because two of your guys got in. Joe Klecko, you think about what he meant to the Jets for so many years. And then, of course, Darrell Revis. I mean, Darrell Revis put so much excitement into the Jet fan base because it was kind of like, you know what? He made watching the Jets must see TV because it was basically, okay, who is this guy going to shut down on a weekly basis? And again, like I said before, it wasn't just like Joe Schmo out there who he was covering at wide receiver. Some of the best wide receivers of that era, Darrell Revis covered them, shut them down, and basically gave the league notice that, you know what? If you're a quarterback, you might want to think twice about throwing his way, hence the term Revis Island. But nonetheless, everybody in this class is well deserving of their spots. And it's going to be very interesting to look forward to this summer for the enshrinement. So, folks, that is going to wrap it up. And as always, I want to take this time out to thank you for tuning into the 300 Pounds of Sports Knowledge podcast here on YouTube. I want to take this time out to thank all of you fine folks out there for tuning in. And if you have not already, please feel free to subscribe to this channel. Now, if you're on Twitter, please feel free to follow me at 300 Pounds of Sports. And like I always say, if you follow me, it will be my pleasure to follow you right back. There's also the sports discussion group on Facebook at the Sports Depot 365. Now you can check it out. Drop a line and be a part of one of the better sports debating sites going on social media. So once again, fine folks, my name is William Martin. I'm signing off, saying take care and have yourselves a wonderful day.